There is a photograph taken in Chicago in 1893 that I keep coming back to, not because of what is in the frame, the white towers, the lagoons, the crowds in their Sunday clothes, but because of what is not in it. The people in that photograph are standing inside a city that had been built in under 2 years, a city with its own power grid, its own police force, its own postal system, its own population of roughly 27 million visitors over 6 months. And then, when the calendar turned to November and the gates closed, that city was burned to the ground. Not abandoned, not dismantled, burned. And almost no one who studies the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition asks why that was the only available option. I started looking into this the way I look into most things, sideways. I was researching something else entirely, a question about municipal infrastructure in the American Midwest in the 1880s, and I kept running into this strange gravitational pull toward Jackson Park, Chicago, and a construction project that the official record describes as a marvel of American ingenuity and coordination. 600 acres of swampy lakefront, 200 buildings, 14 main exhibition halls, completed on schedule. Completed, the record says, by a workforce that was recruited, housed, fed, and managed in a way that had no real precedent in American urban history to that point. I want to sit with that claim for a moment, because no real precedent is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. When Daniel Burnham was appointed Director of Works for the Exposition in 1891, he inherited a project that should have been impossible. The site was marshland. The deadline was fixed. The 400th anniversary of Columbus's landfall was not going to wait. The scale of construction required was larger than anything attempted in the United States outside of wartime, and yet within 18 months the grounds were not merely functional, they were transcendent. Visitors arriving by rail in the summer of 1893 described stepping out of the station and feeling as though they had left America entirely. That sensation was not accidental, it was engineered, and the more I looked at how it was engineered, the more uncomfortable I became with the standard explanations. The Court of Honor, the central basin flanked by the main exhibition buildings, was covered in a material called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber that could be molded into any form and painted to resemble marble or stone. It was temporary material designed to look permanent. Every facade in the White City was, in a technical sense, a stage set, a surface applied over a wooden skeleton. Beautiful, yes. Imposing, absolutely. But built with the explicit understanding that it would not survive a single Chicago winter. This is the part that puzzles me most, and the part I find myself returning to when I read the contemporary accounts. Because the people who visited the fair, and 27 million people, is not a rounding error. It represents roughly 40% of the entire American population at the time, did not experience it as a stage set. They experienced it as a revelation. There are letters in the archives, accessible through the Chicago History Museum and various university collections, in which ordinary working Americans describe arriving at the exposition and weeping, not from joy exactly, from something closer to grief, from the sudden confrontation with a version of their world that was more ordered, more beautiful, more humane than the one they had left behind in their cities and their towns. A woman named Harriet Monroe, born in Chicago in 1860, a poet who would later found Poetry magazine, wrote in her memoir that the White City was the first time she had seen American public space treated as though it had been designed for the people who occupied it. She was describing something that should be unremarkable, a public place built for the public, and experiencing it as a shock. I don't think she was being sentimental. I think she was being precise, because if you look at what American cities actually looked like in 1893, not the idealized version, the real one, the White City was not merely a contrast, it was a rebuke. Chicago itself, just 3 miles away, was one of the most congested, polluted, violent, and infrastructurally chaotic cities in the Western world. The stockyards were within smelling distance of the exposition grounds. The tenement districts to the south housed workers in conditions that multiple independent investigators of the period described in terms that I find impossible to reproduce here without editorial intervention. This was a city that was simultaneously one of the fastest growing economies in human history, and a place where the people generating that growth lived in conditions that would be classified today as a public health emergency. And into the middle of this Someone built a city where the streets were clean, the lighting worked at night, the sewage disappeared, the food was safe, and the architecture asked you to consider the possibility that human beings deserved better than what they were being given. The math of this does not close neatly for me. The exposition cost approximately $33 million to build. That is the figure in the official record. The total economic activity it generated, ticket sales, concessions, transportation, lodging, peripheral commerce, was estimated at roughly $300 million over those 6 months, with effects that economists of the period projected would reverberate through the Midwest for a decade. These numbers are available in the preliminary report of the Director of Works, which is held in collections at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and portions of which have been digitized and are publicly searchable. 33 million in, 300 million out. Tenfold return on a temporary installation that was then destroyed. No permanent infrastructure, no parks that remained, no housing that survived, no municipal facilities that could be transferred to the city that hosted it. The buildings that were not burned were allowed to deteriorate until they collapsed, with the exception of the Palace of Fine Arts, which became the Field Museum, one building out of more than 200, preserved almost as an afterthought. I keep asking myself what the logic of that disposal was, and I keep arriving at an answer that I am genuinely uncertain about, which is this. Perhaps the city that was built in Jackson Park was never intended to become a permanent argument. Perhaps the people who built it understood, on some level, that what they had created was a demonstration of a different way of organizing human space, and that a demonstration by definition must be temporary. Otherwise, it stops being a demonstration and starts being a precedent. This is where I have to be honest with you. I don't know. I genuinely don't know whether there was anything deliberate in the decision to destroy what had been built, whether it represented a retreat from a vision that had become inconvenient, or simply the practical end of a temporary structure that was never designed to survive. The records I've found do not resolve this question. In fact, the records I've found deepen it, because there is a secondary archive that I did not expect to find, and it concerns not the construction of the fair, but its aftermath, and specifically what happened to the people who built it. The labor force assembled for the Columbian Exposition was, by any measure, extraordinary. At peak construction, the site employed somewhere between 40 and 70,000 workers. The figure varies depending on which contractor roles you consult, and several of those roles are incomplete. These workers came from across the United States and from Europe. They included skilled craftsmen, ironworkers, carpenters, plasterers, fresco painters, who were recruited specifically because they possessed knowledge and techniques that were not commonly available in the American Midwest. Many of them had worked on civic projects in France, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. They were brought to Chicago not merely for their labor, but for their expertise in constructing a particular kind of public space. When the fair closed and the burning began, those workers dispersed. The record becomes thin very quickly after November 1893. Some returned to Europe. Some remained in Chicago and found work in the construction boom that followed the exposition. But a significant number, and I cannot give you a precise count because the records do not supply one, went back to lives in American cities that bore no resemblance to the place they had just spent 2 years constructing. I think about a man named Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed the landscape of the Kew Exposition, the lagoons, the planting, the spatial sequence that led visitors from the train station to the Court of Honor. Olmsted was born in 1822 in Hartford, Connecticut. He had spent his career arguing that public space, parks, boulevards, open greenways, was not a luxury but a medical and social necessity. He had designed Central Park in New York and Prospect Park in Brooklyn on exactly that argument, and in 1893, at the age of 71, he produced what he privately called his best work, a unified landscape that demonstrated at full scale what an American city could feel like if it were designed with the same care as a private estate. Olmsted's notes from the Exposition period, some of which are available through the Library of Congress Olmsted Papers collection, show a man who was deeply aware of the demonstration quality of what he was building. He wrote, in a letter to his partner Charles Eliot, that the Exposition was an argument made in topography and water. He believed the argument would persist. He believed that people who had experienced the White City would return to their own cities with a changed standard of expectation. What he could not have anticipated or perhaps what he understood and refused to fully acknowledge, was how quickly that argument could be unmade, not by counter-argument, but simply by erasure. By 1896, 3 years after the fair closed, almost nothing physical remained of what had been built. The main buildings had been burned in July 1894, an event that is typically attributed to the instability of the period. The Pullman strike was underway, the country was in a severe economic depression, and the grounds had become a temporary shelter for homeless men. The fire, whatever its specific origin, was not extensively investigated. The inquiry that followed was brief, and its conclusions were not widely reported. The landscape that Olmsted had designed survived longer, but only in diminished form. The lagoons silted up. The plantings died back. The spatial logic that had given the exposition grounds their peculiar power, the sense that you were moving through a city that had been organized around your experience of it, disappeared as the grounds reverted to an undifferentiated park, and the 27 million people who had walked through those grounds went back to cities that remained exactly as they had been before. Imagine someone, call her a composite because she is, a woman of perhaps 30 years old in 1893, who traveled from a mill town in Ohio or Indiana or western Pennsylvania to see the exposition. She saved for this trip for years. She came with her sister or her neighbor or her church group. She entered through the south gate and walked north toward the basin, and she saw, for the first and only time in her life, a public space that was designed for her, not for commerce, not for transit, not for the movement of goods or the management of labor, for her specifically, as a person who deserved to stand somewhere beautiful. She stood there for an afternoon or a week, or however long she could afford, and then she went home. And what she went home to was a street that had not been repaved since before the Civil War, a neighborhood where the nearest park, if there was one, was maintained by a private association that did not allow people like her to use it freely, a city that was growing as fast as any city in human history and spending almost nothing of that growth on the question of what it felt like to live inside it. The gap between those two things, the city she had stood in for 1 week in August 1893 and the city she would live in for the rest of her life, is what Harriet Monroe was describing when she said she wept. There is one more piece of this I want to give you before I leave it, and it concerns a number that appears in the records of the exposition's Department of Supervision. In the months following the fair's closure, as the grounds were being cleared, an accounting was done of the materials salvaged from the demolished buildings: lumber, metal fittings, glass, electrical equipment. The salvage value was calculated, and the number appears in the official post-exposition report, which is held at the Chicago History Museum and which I have read in full. The salvage value of materials recovered from more than 200 buildings was listed at approximately $250,000 against a construction cost of $33 million. Less than 1% of what was built was considered worth preserving. I don't know what to make of that number. I've sat with it for months, and I keep arriving at different interpretations that feel equally incomplete. The most charitable reading is simply that staff, the material the buildings were made of, had no residual commercial value and could not practically be repurposed. The less charitable reading is that the decision about what to preserve was made before the buildings were built, and that the number simply confirms a prior conclusion. The last Americans who walked those grounds as a functioning city are gone now. The youngest visitors in 1893, the children who held their parents' hands in the court of honor and looked up at the towers and felt something shift in their understanding of what the world could look like, they are gone. What they felt in that moment is not recorded anywhere I can find. What they did with that feeling when they went home is not recorded anywhere either. Whether it changed them, whether it produced in the decades that followed some quiet and untrackable pressure toward the parks and boulevards and civic spaces that did eventually get built in American cities in the 20th century, is a question I cannot answer from the archive. I don't think that's an accident. I think the ordinary experience of that city, not the speeches of its planners, not the reports of its directors, not the journalism of its chroniclers, but the private, physical, bodily experience of 27 million working people walking through a place that treated them as though they mattered, was simply never written down in a way that persisted. What persisted was the official record, the construction reports, the attendance figures, the budget summaries, The photographs of the buildings, not the photographs of the people's faces as they looked at the buildings. That asymmetry might be the most honest thing about the whole project. The fair produced extraordinary documentation of itself as architecture and as spectacle. It produced almost no documentation of itself as experience, and the buildings were burned, and the landscape was abandoned, and the workers went home, and the city of Chicago, 3 miles north, continued to grow in the direction it had always been growing, without clean streets or reliable power or sewage that disappeared or architecture that asked its residents to consider what they deserved. What remains now is Jackson Park itself, still there, still technically public, still bearing a faint spatial memory of what was organized there once. If you walk the grounds today, on the south side of Chicago, you can find the places where the lagoons were. The land still holds the contours. The Museum of Science and Industry is still standing in its original exposition building, the one structure that survived intact, its white facade a replica now, the original. Plaster long replaced, the surface maintained as a gesture toward something most visitors cannot quite name. There is a photograph in the Chicago History Museum's digital collection, freely searchable, free to view, taken from inside the Court of Honor in late October 1893. A few weeks before the gates closed. The grounds are empty of visitors. The season has ended, and the maintenance crews have not yet begun their work of dismantling. The buildings are still standing. The water in the basin is still. The light is the flat gray light of a Midwestern autumn afternoon. It looks like a city the morning after everyone has left and before anyone has decided what to do with what remains. I think about that photograph more than I should. About what it would have taken to make different decisions in the weeks that followed, about what it would have meant for Chicago, and for the cities like Chicago all across America, if even a portion of what was built had been allowed to stay, about whether the people who made those decisions understood what they were erasing, or whether they simply could not see it as anything other than what they called it, a temporary exhibition, a World's Fair, an event with a beginning and an end. I don't know. I keep coming back to that gray water and to the towers reflected in it, and to the fact that they were already, in that photograph, just a reflection, something that had existed briefly, completely, and now was already in the process of becoming the past. The buildings are gone, the grounds are open, the records are in Chicago, and somewhere in the account books of the Department of Supervision, the number is still there, waiting for someone to ask what it means. $33 million built. $250,000 saved. Everything else was smoke.